History can do without one man. Who am I that I can't just kind of throw away my life on this quest to write one perfect sentence? Once you can face your mortality, you realize, I really have nothing to lose. So why don't I do the one thing I dream of doing? And that is creating something that transcends not just my experience, but really connects with a lot of people.
I remember looking up from the book and looking around and almost feeling like, I hope no one knows what I'm reading or thinking right now.
There are a lot of accounts of people who've been reading that particular story, and they fainted on subway platforms, or they fainted sitting in public transport. I am always trying to recreate the kind of strength that stories had when I was a child, stories that you would hear around a campfire, stories that would sort of completely terrify you and overwhelm you. And so anytime a short story can have any kind of a strong effect like that, whether it's people passing out or people weeping, I love to see 20-something people start to cry, especially if they're young men. That's the kind of huge effect that I think stories can have, and completely reaffirms my choice to be a writer.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Chuck Palahniuk, the American best-selling novelist and journalist, best known for writing Fight Club and Choke. Over the past 24 years, you published 23 best-selling books, including 17 novels, a collection of essays, a travel guide, 2 coloring books, and a personal memoir. Your 1996 book, Fight Club, was adapted into the Hollywood blockbuster movie starring Brad Pitt and Edward Norton, which the New York Times called the defining cult movie of our time. In 2005, during a live reading of your horror story Guts, 67 people fainted due to graphic content, and today you continue to push the boundaries of storytelling. Your latest book, The Invention of Sound, is the chilling tale of a father searching for his missing daughter and has been described as, quote, your most suspenseful, daring, and genre-defining work yet. Chuck, welcome to London Real.
Hey, thank you very much. Wow. Just to correct, it wasn't 60. I've never had 63 people faint at one event. The most I've ever had is 8 people. And that was in Brighton, England, at the Brighton Fringe Festival.
Do English people faint more often than Americans?
No, it was just that it was such a vast crowd. It might have been 1,800 people in this Corn Exchange Hall, this big Victorian sort of huge cavernous building.
And was that... while we're on this, was that a win for you? I mean, is that always something that you like to see, or is that something you'll always remember, or was it just something that surprised you?
I am always trying to recreate the kind of strength that stories had when I was a child, stories that you would hear around a campfire, stories that would sort of completely terrify you and overwhelm you. And so anytime a short story can have any kind of a strong effect like that, whether it's people passing out or people weeping, I love to see 20-something people who have it so together. I love to see them start to cry, especially if they're young men. That's the kind of huge effect that I think stories can have, and completely reaffirms my choice to be a writer.
And do you think if they were reading the same story as opposed to being in a room where you're reciting it, would they have the same reaction, or is there something different with that group energy and the voice tonality or vibrations?
There are a lot of accounts of people who've been reading that particular story, and they fainted on subway platforms, or they fainted sitting in public transport. So I even saw a man standing in line at a book event waiting to get a book signed, and he was reading the story, and he fainted standing there in line. So the story seems to hold up. But for other stories, in particular, the one that tends to make people weep, I think delivery is a large part of that one.
Yeah, I honestly recall moments in my life over the past 24 years where I was reading one of your books, and I remember looking up from the book and looking around and almost feeling like, I hope no one knows what I'm reading or thinking right now. Almost like I had to look over my shoulder, as if someone was reading my mind, or even knowing what you were saying, that I might be shamed somehow.
And that's kind of the wonderful bonus of a book, is that you go into it all by yourself, and you're the only person experiencing it. And I think that's why a book can go to places that movies just can't. Movies and television and music. Well, music can be consumed alone, but everything else risks being consumed by a very large group. Yeah, books have that privacy.
And I guess when you're reading it, you can take yourself to places in your mind. Well, maybe your subconscious can know to take you places you normally wouldn't go. And those can be more terrifying than any CGI graphic Hollywood could ever create.
And also, through the abstraction of language, you can actually depict things that would overwhelm the audience if they were to see them literally made and depicted in a film, that the audience would have to walk away or shut down, leave the narrative. But language gives you so much abstraction that you can depict these things and get away with it without completely shutting down the audience.
And I've heard that you're really intentional about your language to make sure that the reader can first of all, you can convey certain emotions, but also so they don't necessarily formulate things in their mind. I think you said you don't use abstractions?
That's one of the main tenets of the style of minimalism that I was taught, is that abstractions and pejorative language, things like that, are all shortcuts, and they cheat the reader out of a more powerful experience. That, when you have a character describe another character as being 6 foot tall, then you've lost the opportunity to describe the point of view character's life and experience, and how for them another character of that size would occur. Because we never really see things in terms of, a 100-degree day, a 6 foot tall man driving 35 miles an hour. The point is to use all of those descriptive opportunities as a way of describing the point of view character's perception of the world.
And I think you've also said, if I was telling you a story, I wouldn't say, Chuck, I met this guy and he was 6 foot tall and it was 100 degrees out. I would have been like, this guy was massive and it was sweltering and I was going super fast. I mean, we wouldn't talk to each other if we were telling that story that way.
Exactly. You would particularize the language, and you would burn the language, what we call, you would misstate things, but you would misstate things in a way where the language was just your own, and it was a language that was really unique just to that story. And so the toughest part of my job is to reinvent storytelling as appropriate for every single story, whether it's a novel or a short story.
That's tricky to do.
It's exhausting. And with so much of my work is about listening to people and listening to how they burn the language, how they sort of warp and reinvent the language when they tell a story. And with the lockdown, that's become almost impossible.
Where would you go to listen to that? And would you do it on the sly, or was it just conversations with people you knew?
A lot of times it would be in groups. It would be at parties, because at parties, you're looking for people who throw out a topic, and then you're looking to see how readily people engage with the topic. At the workshop that I was running with students just before the lockdown, we were talking about a magazine store, a used bookstore that had recently closed. And someone in the group said that people who were selling their used copies, their collections of Playboy, would no longer have a place to sell them. And then somebody else said, I wonder if that's how the big box of porn in the woods happens. And everyone at the table, students from the age of 18 to 65, 70, all leaned forward and they all had a story about finding a box of porn or a duffel bag or a garbage bag of porn in the woods or in the desert or on the beach or stuffed up a tree. And they all found these things as children. And none of them had ever talked about the experience. And so finding that experience that resonates with everyone, but that no one has really openly discussed, is a big part of listening. And then listening to the language with which they finally talk about it. It's so powerful to discover that thing that everyone holds in common, but everyone thinks that they're alone in their experience of.
It's interesting how you create, Chuck, because I always assumed, and maybe this is true of a typical novelist, is they're like, I'm going to make this masterpiece and I'm going to drop it on the world and they're going to be in awe at what I created. But you seem to, I'm testing my stuff in the world. In fact, I'm mirroring the world to a certain extent and finding these things that people never knew existed. And then I'm putting my construct on it and then I'm putting it back out. But you must already be somewhat confident that there's something resonating there because, like I said, you've almost pre-road tested it.
Exactly. You've taken it to so many people and you have tested whether or not they engage with it, whether or not they have a similar experience. And then they help develop the idea, because if they have experienced something like that, then they can sort of flesh out the theme with another example, probably a better example of what I brought to them. And they can also tell me if the theme or the idea has been explored in popular culture in recent history, because you just don't want to be treading well-trod ground. And so taking it to people and sort of field testing it does that. That tests whether people engage. It develops the idea with those people's experience, and it tests whether or not the thing is worth pursuing if it's already been sort of explored already in the culture.
So parties kind of used to be your research and development lab in a way, but now that's harder to do, or it's impossible to do, because you could have those same people on a Zoom call and they might say nothing if you bring up the box of porn on a Zoom call, whereas in a group environment, you could see the cues and then it would start.
Exactly. And the other most important aspect of testing it is that, especially when I teach, the most important feedback people can get to their work is when they read it aloud and they listen to the emotional reaction, that kind of unintellectualized gasp or laugh, or that fantastic silence that indicates tension. Because after that, what they get is intellectualized academic feedback, which is almost entirely useless. What you want to hear is how the story works in front of an audience, where it lags, where it gets boring, to discover where the laughs are, where you didn't realize there was a laugh there. You need an extra time, an extra beat to allow that laugh to build, where you might be able to add a laugh after that. And so reading it and testing it in front of an audience just for their unfiltered emotional reaction is the most important aspect of that process. And on services like Zoom, it doesn't work because only one person at a time can make a noise.
It sounds more like stand-up comedy, Chuck, than what I would assume the writing process is like.
It's very similar to how you would open a show out of town, and you would run this play or musical through a lot of different smaller markets and really get the kinks out of it before you would eventually take it to a big market, open it in New York.
Do you think a lot of writers read their work to other people and get those reactions? Or is it usually like, read this, and then tell me what you think afterwards.
That read it and tell me what you think afterwards, I hold very little, respect for that. Because what you get is the sort of obligated, intellectualized fixing of the work. And there's a lot of politics involved in that. And there's a lot of kind of showing off involved in that. So that is, almost more detrimental than it is beneficial. What I want is to be able to read it and to test the clarity. The only question I really have afterwards is, did you understand everything that took place in this story? Because clarity is the most important quality of a story in my mind.
Interesting. I guess that's interesting. Do you ever want someone to have to read something 10 times before they really understand it? Or do they read it 10 times to see it in 10 different ways at 10 different times in their life?
The latter. Because the first time they're going to read it, they're going to get the horizontal of it. They're going to get the physical plot of what happens and how it ends. And subsequent readings at different points in their life, when they're at different emotional places, they will read it and they will get different messages from it. So, yeah, a bunch of readings, but across a long period of time.
But you want clarity on that first reading, no matter what.
Exactly. Oh my, it took me forever as a child to learn to read. And I was always so self-conscious about not being able to read until, all of my classmates could read, that I just don't want to make the reader feel stupid. I never want to confuse the reader or make the reader feel like they're not understanding what's taking place. So physical verbs, a lot of clarity, a certain amount of repetition, and things paced in such a way that the reader is actually kind of ahead of the narrator, and the reader will come to realize what's taking place before the narrator realizes the true nature of what's happening. And when the reader feels smarter than the narrator, then you completely have the reader under your control. The reader feels sympathetic to the point of view character, and the reader feels so joyous that they're actually sort of ahead of the game. And that's when you hit them with the big, big plot event.
And you use this technique in all of your works or your fiction works.
I try to. It is what I aspire to do. But sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Everything is an experiment.
I just had a weird thought, and tell me if I'm way off here. I'm wondering if that's why people like watching YouTubers and reality TV, because we can all see how someone's going into a train wreck. They can't, almost by definition, because that's what life is. And we get to see it in real time. And then something ultimately happens. And then, like you said, we have that feeling of, I always knew that was going to happen. Do I have anything there or not?
What is the first thing that Scarlett O'Hara says in Gone with the Wind?
It's that war line, right?
War, war, war. There is not going to be any war. And the moment she says that, the reader thinks, oh, you poor, beautiful, charming, wealthy idiot. And regardless of all of her gifts, we are smarter than her, and we know that she's about to go through something really miserable. And so we care about her, and we feel superior to her. And that's not a bad place to put the reader.
Does the same thing happen in Taxi Driver, where you're kind of going along the narrative with Travis, and as I remember, about 30, 40 minutes in, he kind of goes off the reservation to where you're like, okay, now this guy's taking it even further than I thought he was going to take it. And then does something similar happen in that storyline, or is that a different technique there?
I always talk about how do you create authority? And I always see that as one form of creating authority is to dare to go to a place that the reader didn't anticipate, or that the reader didn't think that anyone would have the nerve to go to. I'm thinking of in Jesus' Son, there's a short story called Dirty Wedding. That's a story collection by Dennis Johnson. And in the story, Dirty Wedding, the main character, who's known as Fuckhead, takes his girlfriend to an abortion clinic. And he's waiting while she's having the procedure. And a nurse comes out and says, Michelle is at peace now. And the point of view character says, is she dead? And the nurse becomes very flustered and says, no, of course she's not dead. Why would you even ask that? And Fuckhead says, because I kind of wish she was. And that moment is so brutal, but it establishes Dennis Johnson's authority, that he is going to do things in this story that completely surprise us and that are completely brutally honest, but also really ugly. And after that, we read him with this kind of trepidation, but also this respect. It's as if he's kind of reached out and slapped us. We have kind of a new sort of wariness, but we're also so much more engaged.
Yeah, I think that kind of happens to Taxi Driver a little bit too, when he starts shaving his head and burning his arm over the stove, and you're like, okay, he's taking it to another level. Now, I was with him, now I'm watching him do something, but I can't stop watching him as well.
And then ultimately, when it leads to that huge bloodbath in the hallways, that doesn't come out of left field anymore, because we've now been kind of primed that anything can happen at this point.
Yeah, but the funny part is when he takes his date to the porn movie in the beginning, you can kind of forgive him. You're like, he didn't know any better. He probably, la. So it's like you're still trying to stay with him as he starts going further and further away. But then at some point he goes so far to where now you're spectating as opposed to maybe accompanying him. I don't know.
It's interesting when you sort of compare that scene to the scene where Dustin Hoffman takes Catherine Ross to the porn movie in The Graduate in order to really offend her and hurt her. It's just interesting how you see the same thing happen. One is played for comedy and one is played for drama.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I read somewhere, I heard you on an interview talk about how when you look at your work many years later, you'll read it and realize that your subconscious was actually playing a narrative out in your head or doing something that maybe your conscious mind didn't know it was doing at the time. And that really sat with me over the past couple of days when I was preparing for this. And I had a reflection on what I've been doing here for the past 9 years. And I'll just give you a quick update. I mean, before I started having these conversations with people, I was kind of a Wall Street banker in London, and I was really miserable. And I was trying to do everything I thought was the right thing to do, which was make as much money as possible. And I was slowly drinking myself to death. And at one point, I just stopped and I started having these conversations, Chuck, and it made no sense. It made no money. But when I look back at the 9 years, I think it was forcing me to do everything I hadn't done in my life, which is forced me to be around strangers. It forced me to put myself on camera. I'm a natural introvert. And it forced me to get uncomfortable in ways that my constructed life kept me away from, but it was also making me miserable. And now when I look back, it was the exact antidote I needed. In a way, I hate to make this analogy, but it was almost like my Fight Club, where I had to push myself into these structured, uncomfortable situations to do what I had almost conditioned myself not to do because of this societal norm that says when you make the money and you got to this, you'll be successful. So I don't know, I'm curious what you think of that, and how do you look at your work in retrospect? Do you see parts of your character that was crying for help or, pulling you in certain directions?
The workshop where I learned minimalism was led by a man named Tom Spanbauer. And Tom's sort of program of teaching, he called dangerous writing. And he said the point is to write about something that you don't really fully remember and you don't really fully understand, but it troubles you. And it's something you can't resolve in your life. So that in writing about it, you can explore it through a metaphor. And that way, even if it never sells, then at least you have the kind of benefit of the therapy of having cathartically looked at every aspect of this issue, again, through a metaphor. You've exaggerated it, you've blown it up out of proportion, you've turned it into a gigantic monster, and at least on the page you've resolved it, and you've really exhausted your emotional reaction to it. And so typically, by the time you're done with the story or the book, your reaction is gone, and that issue is gone. It is so amazing. It's so much like magic that by the time you're writing about the story, the real issue has vanished from your life. You come out of writing and the thing is gone entirely. It's just fantastic. So even if you didn't find an editor, an agent, a publisher, you would keep doing this dangerous writing.
Do you need that mentor, though, to keep pushing you to go into the darkness? And you have to show up and prove your work and have the workshop people come back to you and say, come on, Chuck, this is BS. You're not actually going where you need to go.
Well, workshop helps. Oh my gosh. To get that reaction every week, and to get just the task validated. Tom always used to say that 99% of what any workshop does is just give you license, validate the task of writing, because otherwise you're just a person terrified that you're wasting your time. And in workshop, you're able to discuss these issues, but in a craft way. It's not, what am I doing with my life? It's what is the character doing? And what if the character took this action? And isn't the character aware of this thing or this element? And what about if this other element came in? So you're talking about it in this kind of hands-off, detached way. And that's really kind of the only way you can talk about these things that are so frightening to you, so kind of submerged in your subconscious.
Interesting. I think therapists do that with kids, where they'll have like a doll or a stuffed animal, and they'll ask them how the stuffed animal feels, and they can tell them how the stuffed animal feels, but they don't tell them how they feel. I don't know. It just kind of came to my mind,
There's a writer, Steve Allman, and he teaches writing workshops around the country. And he's made the observation that talk therapy, was very popular and very effective, but it was also very expensive. And so it was more or less replaced by pharmaceuticals. And now people are coming back to talk therapy, but they're doing it in the form of writing workshops where it's very cheap. Sometimes it's free. And you get to have the benefit of kind of a rap group or a therapy group, but you're all doing it under the guise of writing a fiction.
That's fascinating. And you have to do the work. You can't just show up and talk. You kind of have to go back and create something and go deeper. But there's a little more accountability there, maybe.
And also you have to do it in such a way that it's engaging. You can't just go and kind of vomit like you would with a therapist. It has to be, something that engages, that's clear, that other people can relate to.
Yeah, I never realized that workshops could do that much. I just assumed it was a way to write things, but I guess it's much more than that. There's another observation I had when I was looking through the past 9 years, and every now and then we have a guest on my show that, I don't know, resonates with me, and we go make a documentary film with them. We hang out with them for weeks or months, and we tell a story around them. And I've got posters on our wall of 6 of them. And when I look at them, Chuck, they're all these alpha males. That's what they are. People come by and they're like, why are they all men? Why are they all these alphas? As a Navy SEAL or a punk rocker or a high performance coach or a bodybuilder? And I'm like, I don't know. But when I look back at my 9 years, I feel like I've been searching for that male role model I never had. Maybe that's a father figure. And now when I look at the people watching us, I feel like to a certain extent, that's a lot of what's happening too. And it's mostly males, but still females too. And funny enough, Chuck, it's those strong archetypal male figures that get the most views, even though sometimes they're politically incorrect. But it's almost like this thing I feel like maybe I'm searching for, or maybe the world is searching for to a certain extent. I know you explore that in some of your works, but just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, Joseph Campbell did a lot of work around what he called the secondary father, that men and women have a primary father, a biological father. And that father can take them to a certain point in their life, but that father cannot be kind of the master to their apprenticeship. That father can't be as kind of brutally strict as the secondary father can. And the secondary father typically was a teacher or a drill instructor or a coach or sometimes someone in the clergy, but someone who could, or a master. In my case, you could argue my secondary father was Tom Spanbauer. And I went into Tom's workshop and I thought I could write, and I couldn't write. I couldn't write shit. I was writing really bad Stephen King ripoff garbage. And Tom said, no abstracts, no pejorative language. Tom gave me 1,000 rules, and he made me write according to these rules. And so in a way, you're describing secondary fathers, people who have achieved a kind of mastery in a field, and they can be the really hard-ass, badass sort of coach that people need beyond the primary father, beyond the biological father. And I think it's a kind of model of master and apprentice that we've forgotten about. And so we have a lot of sort of apprentices looking around for who does what they themselves would like to do.
And why can't the primary father, be in that role? Is it because ultimately they love the child too much to be strong and rigid? Or is it that the child will never actually listen to the father because because they know that ultimately they love them, so they know they won't push him as hard as someone that could walk away? I don't know. It's a complicated question.
I think it's a little of all of those. The biological father can't risk losing the affection of the child, and may not have the skill set that the child really needs. So it's kind of a crapshoot whether the father could even teach what the child needs taught. Yeah, especially in a culture where people aspire to something better than their parents or different than their parents. They need to find a secondary father who's not just an extension of the biological father.
Yeah, it's true. Again, and I'm looking at the wall of my secondary fathers, and they all bring something unique to the table. One is a physical, one is a psychedelic master, one is a high performance, one is a Navy SEAL. They all bring all these different parts that I guess one man could never bring anyways. And maybe back in the days of the clan and the village, I would have exposure to these different men. But, in this modern era, I guess you kind of have to search them out.
In a way, too, the secondary father also connects the apprentice with the larger world. That when I finally wrote a publishable manuscript, it was Tom Spanbauer, my teacher, who said, you need to submit it to Tom's agent. And so that's how I got my agent, and the agent connected me with publishers. And so the secondary father has connections in the world that the primary father is not likely to have.
Right. It's interesting. I just had children. I've got a 3 and a 4-year-old son, and I'm looking at them, and I mean, it's hard to imagine. I love them so much. I've never ever felt love like this. And so I don't know if I'll be able to be the disciplinarian I need to be. And funny enough, one of my mentors says this. He says, I don't want my kids to love me. He said, 25 years after I'm dead, I want them to respect me. Okay, now he's the hardcore of that spectrum, but that's the way he mentors, to where he tries to physically remove that bond of love so he can mentor in the best possible way. But I think it's rare for fathers to be able to do something like that. And maybe it's good they can't also.
And I would have to agree with him, because I grew up with a kind of ideal that I wanted John Houseman as my secondary father. I wanted somebody who would just be really brutal and not give me a participation trophy, who would say, not good enough, and just throw my work back at me. growing up, I grew up in a very rural community, and I really admired the Mormon families because the Mormon sons always had to call their father sir. And my family felt that that was so demeaning and so ridiculous and so antiquated that they made fun of the Mormon kids for calling their father sir and their mothers ma'am. Well, that was something that was a kind of respect that I longed for. I just dreamed of that.
I totally understand what you mean. I mean, one of the lines in Fight Club that everyone loves to quote is, we're a generation of men raised by women. And it goes on further. I'm wondering if another woman's exactly what we need. But for the first part, I mean, my parents were divorced when I was 7, and I saw my dad once every 2 weeks. A lot of us in the newer generation grew up without that father figure. Some would say a lot of the commotion that you see these days and a lot of the protests and things come from not having a father figure in the family for the past 20 or 30 years for certain communities and certain people. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't see it as much of an aberration as I think a lot of people do, because one way in which people achieve a kind of new generation of leadership is through conflict. And whether it's conflict in a military battle or a civil rights conflict, that's where our next generation of leaders emerge. And even if you don't emerge a leader like John Lewis or like Jesse Jackson, these people who came out of the civil rights movement as leaders and established their authority as leaders in a conflict. Even if you didn't come out of as a leader, you still came out with a sense of being tested and having kind of exhausted an aspect of self so that later in life, you wouldn't be constantly regretting that you hadn't taken those chances and done those things when you were a younger person with fewer things to risk.
And so when you see what's happening now, and some people say this is the worst it's ever been, do you see that as just the natural cycle of humanity? And when you look back to 1968 or these other points in time, do you just say, no, this is just something that humanity actually does to itself? It's just the natural evolution of the younger generation, the older generation, new ideas?
I do. I know. I see it as just a really organic cycle of how people establish themselves in the world and how they achieve an adulthood in a world that hasn't given us a lot of really clear channels to adulthood right now. We don't really have a frontier you can go into to kind of, try to establish yourself tabula rasa. So we have to reinvent the frontier by kind of creating these war zones. So I don't see it as the big upset travesty that other people might.
And do you think we also have a tendency to forget and rewrite our own past? I think I heard you commenting recently that when you saw some of the protests in Portland, you were like, what are these kids doing? And then I think one of your friends reminded you that you used to do this too, Chuck. Do you think sometimes the older generation forgets that they once were young and either did these things or thought these things too?
Oh, one thing that kills me is my father worked for the railroad. He was a brakeman, and he would get us up in the middle of the night and put us in a pickup truck, my 2 sisters, my brother and I. And he would drive us through the desert for hours until we came across an enormous train accident, a freight train that had been derailed. And we would be there with all the other kind of subsistence families in the area. And we would loot the train. We would take whatever was being shipped in the boxcars that were busted open and all these things that were just in disarray. And I forget about that. And the other day I was kind of pissing and moaning about the looting in Chicago and the looting in Minneapolis, the looting in Portland. And a friend of mine just kind of leaned in and said, you did that. You did that as a kid, as a teenager. So you really can't say too much about people who are doing it now. So yeah, there is a big aspect of forgetting our own lives when we start to criticize other people's.
Yeah, and even forgetting how we felt when we were teenagers. Like, I can still remember when I was a teenager thinking, I can't trust anybody over 30 and probably nobody over 25. Like, they don't get it. They'll never get it. I still remember having weird thoughts like that. And I think it's hard for us to really understand how they're feeling in so many ways.
I don't really, I don't think you get over that now until your late 20s and your early 30s. And at that point, you kind of realize that you're going to need, you're not going to have the power and the vitality of youth much longer. And you're going to need to transfer to a different form of power. And you try to do that through education, you try to do that through connections and networking. But youth is going to pass for you. And at that point, you do need to rely on other people.
I was having a conversation with someone recently, and they were in their 20s, and they were asking me lots of questions about life. And I said, honestly, I think your 20s, your late 20s, are the hardest time in your life. They were for me, because the honeymoon of being a kid is over, and yet you haven't built up the processes or even necessarily the neural structure to kind of go to that next level. And you're looking in the mirror saying, I should be further, or I should know more. And like, my late 20s were an absolute mess. I mean, I literally was a 30-year-old boy. I was in New York City quoting your line to all my friends, and I was just a total fuck up at that point. And it wasn't until I finally got away from all that life of New York City and drug addiction and watching Fight Club 100 times on replay and moved to London at 31 that I finally got to where I needed to go. But I was so hard on myself for those last few years of my 20s. I don't know, for some reason, Chuck, I thought I should have figured it out by now. And every month that went by that I didn't, I just was almost beat myself up even more. I'm curious what you think of that.
I think that's completely natural and organic. And it kind of breaks my heart when I get students who want to learn writing, and they're 18 or 19 years old. And I just tell them not to put the cart before the horse, that they have 10 years in which to kind of put together all the best stories that they're going to tell for the rest of their lives. All the poorly chosen friends, all the misadventures, all the anecdotes that they will be called upon to tell forever. When you think about Jack London, you think about Charles Darwin, their formative years were those years. And they spent the rest of their lives milking those experiences. So I always tell my younger students, yeah, it's great that you want to learn this skill, but don't neglect the messing up part of your life, because you need the messing up part of your life as the material that you will be working for the rest of your life. Once you're 31, 32, 33, then your skill set in writing and your experience in messing up will come together, and they will work together, and you'll have stuff.
Yeah, it's fascinating. About 2 years ago, one of my guests came into London Real, and his name is John Joseph. He's the lead singer of the hardcore punk band, the Cro-Mags. They were big in New York City in the 90s. And he challenged me to run an Ironman race, because after partying and smoking crack and all the stuff he did, he finally got sober, and Ironman races were his way to stay focused and clean. And so I agreed. I went to New York City and I trained with him. And when all of that physical training was happening in a place in New York where I almost ruined my life and overdosed twice, and it all came out. And while we were filming the movie, I decided to tell the story for the first time ever. And I hadn't told my wife in 16 years, and it all came out, Chuck. And honestly, I thought that the time in my life was going to be this dark black hole that would never serve any purpose. But it ended up being a massive feature of what we made a film out of. And when so many people saw it, it ended up being this incredible source of light to a lot of people. And it made for a great journey and story that actually now, I'm so glad it all happened. And it planted the seeds for what I would even do later, because once I survived that, I felt almost grateful to be alive, and I felt like I had a new chance at life. So it's funny how those really difficult times of living create all that material for later.
And also imagine if you had just stayed the good boy and you had followed the kind of path that was laid out as the blueprint for success, and you had done everything right, and kept your house clean and detailed your car, just how you would have felt by the age of 40 when all the opportunity to do that had passed you by. Uh, I think that's the tragedy, is when you reach middle age and you realize that you've been the altar boy all that time. And it's too late to be the kind of acting out bad person who has those experimental experiences.
But Chuck, I almost died. So how far do you push it?
Okay, almost. And that's what I tell people. I say, have fun, choose your friends really poorly, have your adventures, just don't die.
You say that, but if you don't get close, then you're not doing it. And a lot of times you don't have a choice.
And, I come from a kind of a punk aesthetic. And that is that if you don't go too far at some point in the work, you will kick yourself. You will regret having not gone there. Because someday you're going to be an old person and you're going to be shaking your head and saying, why didn't I put that line in? That really line. I was so afraid of offending people. I was so afraid of, being thought poorly of. Why didn't I just do it? There's the line in Fight Club where Tyler and Marla have sex for the first time. And I thought the most romantic thing you could say is, I want to have your baby. So the Marla character, being who she is, she says, oh, Tyler, I can't wait to have your abortion. And that was the line that just drew lightning bolts. Everyone hated that line. But that line had to go in there because there has to be something that goes too far. Otherwise, you regret, and the whole project just feels like garbage afterwards because you compromised.
And it's funny, as an old man, you'll always look back on that and think, why was I so worried the world was going to end and my career was going to end? Because clearly it wasn't. The old man always knows it wasn't, but the young man is always worried about that time, right?
And I think if I can, as an old guy, if I can talk about social media, I think young people are even more aware of public perception. They're not occupying the kind of creative vacuum that somebody like Thoreau did or somebody like Bernard Shaw did when he moved to Ireland and gave up his banking career. That they're not getting this kind of isolation in a hut that is really needed to develop your own voice, because you're always too aware of what the world might say or what the world is saying.
Yeah, so it's stifling creativity, growth.
Right. Yeah. If people let it. I remember when I first started writing, I would unplug my telephone, and my friends were so angry. They thought it was so rude that someone would unplug their telephone and be unreachable for 2 or 3 hours at a time. And now I think about it, we're so much more connected that unplugging your telephone seems like nothing.
So true. It's so true. You mentioned Fight Club, and I remember, I think it was a book you wrote, or I read some article. I remember this image, Chuck, where I think you were in a hotel bathtub the night before you're going to go on set and meet Brad Pitt and Edward Norton, and you decide to shave your head for some reason. And I remember the story of you talking about shaving your head, and you might have made some cuts, and then you show up on set and you're talking to these guys, and I remember these guys, they think maybe you're Tyler Durden, but you're not. And it was just a weird experience to be the writer on the set of this Hollywood movie. I'm just curious, what do you remember about that whole experience?
That wasn't actually during production. That was the very first time I had ever gone down to pre-production meetings. And everyone in Los Angeles just seems so groomed and so attractive compared to people in Portland, Oregon. And I kind of realized that there was no way I could compete on that level. So I just thought I would just, rather than try to have a great haircut, I would just shave my head. And I used a kind of caustic lye solution called Magic, which is marketed to black men for shaving with. You put it on, it's like Nair, it burns the hair off, and you scrape it off with a spatula. And I did not realize you needed to use a spatula. So I put it on my head, it burned my skin, And then I used a razor and I ended up scraping off 2 or 3 layers of skin. So I ended up with this head that was just this big, bleeding, oozing, bald head. And everything it touched stuck to it. So all throughout all these meetings, anytime something touched my balding, bleeding head, it would stick to it like bits of lint. And there was a strange kind of power in that, in these settings where everyone was so beautifully presented, they would look at me. And there was this sense that I had to be someone, because anyone who was that unattractive and so badly presented had to have some kind of power that would allow them to be in this situation. So there was a kind of authority that came from being the ugly thing. And I loved that. That was just a nice thing to realize.
Is that similar to the Edward Norton character in the movie with the bruises at work, where no one asks him or he has them? Or I guess it's a slightly different dynamic than that.
It is very similar. And in a way, I'm kind of playing with what I call tableau horror. In most horror, you don't see the horrific act take place. In the movie Seven, you're coming across crime scenes after the fact. In the book The Alienist, you're coming across murdered child prostitutes who have been ritually arranged after the fact, because nobody wants to see those horrible acts take place. That would shut down, that would exclude the audience. And in the new book, The Invention of Sound, I wanted to do this kind of tableau horror, but I wanted the scream to be the only existing tableau, the only evidence of the violence that took place. So the scream would become kind of an audio tableau that the reader could be with, because the reader couldn't tolerate the actual violence. And in Fight Club, the kind of black eyes and bruised faces sort of reinvents tableau horror and presents it to the world to see whether or not people will even acknowledge it if it's in their midst. Because typically when I had bruises like that, no one in my workplace would ever mention them. And they became culturally invisible because nobody wanted to know the act of violence that had taken place.
I actually had one of those experiences. So when I moved to London, I started training in mixed martial arts and jiu-jitsu, and I was working in basically a bank. I was a banker. And a couple times I showed up with some really busted up eyes, and I noticed that no one said anything. And I just had the flashback to your book and the movie, because it was so weird. I literally have a butterfly bandage here, and I'm in a suit, and I'm the only one like that, and no one said anything.
It's wonderful. You realize just how they don't want to know. They don't want to know what your private life is like.
When you look back on everything that was Fight Club, how do you feel about it now? I know, and also how do you feel about the fact that it almost never happened? I mean, I think a lot of people don't know the book didn't do well at all. I think you said they were even going to pulp some of the copies that weren't sold. And then all of a sudden it became this massive juggernaut that then became a flop at the box office and then became this cult piece. How do you put that in your own history?
You just keep writing. It was never about sort of selling a book in the first place. It was always about sort of exercising that demon in Tom's dangerous writing. So it was always about doing that fun, interesting exploration through a metaphor, presenting it every week to see if it would work, and then having the community of other writers, having that group of friends that weren't based on proximity. We weren't just people who lived near each other or went to university together or people who worked together. We were people who valued the act of writing, and that would keep us together for decades as a workshop. And so what becomes of the writing is almost inconsequential, because the writing itself is so useful in my life. And I would be doing it regardless of whether or not I ever sold anything or a movie was ever made.
Do you ever wish it didn't happen?
No, because it bought me my freedom from a day job. It was the moment when The Apprentice actually turned out kind of a masterpiece. And that established me as someone who could do this thing. And so, no, I would never, wish it didn't happen.
But it's also not all glamour and gleam, that process.
Making movies is the most boring thing in the entire world. You know what's the only other thing that's more boring than making movies? Rich people. Oh my God.
Tell me.
Rich people who kind of seem to be focused around the abstraction of making money. Their lives aren't very interesting, and their stories are incredibly dull and boring. And their problems are really not fascinating problems. So, I hate being around wealthy people because they have nothing to steal. They have no great experiences. Yeah.
I guess if your one main goal is maximizing your wealth, then you'll always be behaving in a certain way that maybe is conservative or conformative, or is that what you feel and see?
Exactly.
Okay.
And you're not taking these enormous kind of, 20-something risks. And you're not risking looking bad because everyone is constantly avoiding looking bad. And if you can go into a situation and you tell a story that allows you to look bad, you give everyone else their freedom to look bad. And rich people are just not going to take advantage of that freedom. They are never going to really tell that goat story where they were completely slapped down, where they were completely humiliated. And those are the stories people want to hear because people want the comfort of knowing that it happens to other people. And they also want the opportunity to tell their own story about being the goat. And rich people, they just don't tell their goat stories.
And you like telling those goat stories at parties to first get the reaction, put the audience in a certain frame, and then ultimately get them, like you said, to reciprocate. And that's when the gold comes out.
Oh my gosh, I love hazing stories. And I used to talk about, I tell this pretty plain story about working at the Freightliner truck assembly plant. And on my first day, my foreman sent me to a different workstation and said, get our squeegee sharpener and don't come back without the squeegee sharpener. And the foreman at the other workstation would curse me out and send me to another workstation. And I'd spent the whole 8-10 hours being cursed and being sent somewhere else on this wild goose chase. But it introduced me to every foreman I would ever meet. And they all met me as a new hire because every new hire was sent to collect this non-existent tool for their entire first day. And it taught me the entire layout of the plant. So it was kind of this ritualized pilgrimage, this kind of journey in a very Joseph Campbell kind of way. You're sent on a journey, a grail quest to collect a grail that doesn't exist. And you are ritualistically subjugated and humiliated throughout that whole thing. And in doing so, you attain a shared experience that every single one of the people you have worked with have all had that experience. And so it bonds you on your first day. The hazing story does so much. And then if you tell it well enough, it evokes hazing stories from everyone who listens. And those hazing stories just go all over. Some of them, what surgeons do to each other are just brutal. What police do to each other are just brutal. And they're gold. They're fantastic stories.
Yeah, I'm about to tell you my hazing story, but I won't. But
You should tell it.
I got the fraternity hazing story. But hazing is this piece of cultural technology that, like you said, ultimately has a purpose. And yet we phased it out because it's cruel and unkind.
Yeah, it's become kind of a cultural scapegoat. And we really, really lose the function of what it performed for us. It's a shame.
Yeah. Yeah, no, with the fraternity, we just, we had a kind of a Hell Week scenario that was presented to us as pledges in the fraternity. And, we were already kind of being treated as subservient, but when Hell Week happened, which we thought was work week at MIT. We thought we were just fixing up the fraternity house before the term started. It turned into this massive hazing ritual where we had to play the classical music song Bolero on repeat for about 5 days straight and not sleep for 5 days while we were engaged in all these other type of activities just to see if we could hack it. And if we couldn't, then we were shown the door. And, I don't even know if that's allowed these days, but it was so important. And I remember when I finally made it and they gave me my Greek letters that I could wear, meant I was a brother. I didn't take the shirt off for 3 days. I was so proud to be part of this thing. And it became a really defining experience of my life at school. And I don't know if they even have many of those anymore. And it's a shame because it had bad and good with it, but it was this incredible time of men among men and learning the rituals of the wolf pack and how you behave. And if you don't behave that way, the pack is going to let you know. And it taught me a lot about how to deal with men that I never learned my whole life, Chuck, in high school, living with mom and dad. So.
And I would broaden that, that's not just men, that is the world. And when your writing workshop is brutal with you, when I'm brutal with my students, I'm trying to give them a little bit of taste of what the world is going to do to them, what agents are going to do to them, what publishers who don't like their work are going to do to them, what critics are going to do to them, what Amazon one-star reviews are going to do to them. It's kind of toughening them up a little bit. So no matter what happens in the future, you can say, at least I'm not listening to Bolero anymore.
Yeah, I had Tim Kennedy on the show, who was a Green Beret and was one of the top UFC fighters. And he said there was a point when he was training to be a Green Beret where he just thought he knew everything. And he went on a mission and he basically kind of screwed up. And they came back and said, meet me in the boxing ring. And he was really a good boxer and really fancied himself. And he showed up and it was the whole squad. And he had to fight them one by one by one. And he won the first 3 or 4 matches, but the last 3, they beat him to a pulp. And he said that probably wouldn't be allowed today. And I said, so they were loving you? And he said, yeah, Brian, they were. They were showing me the team was more important than the individual. And he said that was such the incredible lesson, but it literally had to be beaten into my head to get it.
Yeah, and that goes to a really difficult dynamic to teach in fiction. And when I hear people talk about you have to outline every project, you have to know every single plot point. And part of me wonders, how can you create transformation if there's no transformation in you as the creator? So if you know everything that's going to happen, then I think chances are the reader is going to anticipate everything that's going to happen. And if you yourself are not coming out as a different person at the end, because you're just basically writing an extension of who you are, already, then what's the point of even doing the work? And so there has to be that destruction of self in order for the creation of the new whatever. You can't go in a winner and come out a winner. You have to lose somewhere in the middle.
And so talk to me about the invention of sound. I mean, do you know how this is going to end? And did you change in writing the book?
Oh my gosh. I thought that was just going to be a quick and dirty novel about a guy whose kid disappeared 17 years ago. And I knew that by the 3rd act, he was going to hear her scream dubbed into a really bad horror movie. And it was going to start a discovery process, and he was going to track down the people who had kidnapped and killed her and get me Mel Gibson on the phone. It was just going to be one of those Liam Neeson thriller movies. And then it went nuts in the 3rd act, and it had that fantastic plot reveal about the huge conspiracy. And it had this... it went global with the whole purpose for why those screams were being collected. And it completely surprised me. And that's why I write, is the 3rd act is always just such a complete revelation. I have no idea that Tyler is going to be the narrator. I have no idea that that the story is going to go where it eventually goes. Uh, and that is so much the joy of doing this thing.
Does it always happen? Or does it always happen with the good ones?
It always happens, but sometimes it takes longer, and you have to be with a kind of longer pregnancy, because when you're waiting for it to happen, you are really miserable because you are so sure it's not going to happen. And you so want to rush things to conclusion. You just want to slap an ending on this thing and send it out and let it be a shitty book in the world. Good enough. But Tom always taught that the longer you can be with the incomplete thing and allow the thing to complete itself, the better the thing will be. And so it's not about getting the baby out. It's about letting the baby take as much time as the baby needs. And then the baby will be its own thing.
And for you, how long can that be? Years? You don't sit on things for 5 or 10 years, though, or do you?
Only short stories.
Okay. The shorter.
Oh my gosh, there are short. I wrote a short story called Zombies. I'd had this idea about what about a kind of cluster of kids in high school who used cardiac defibrillators, and they stuck one electrode on one side of the forehead and one electrode on the other temple. And they pressed that big red button and they put a huge jolt of current right through their frontal lobe. And they did that as a kind of way of lobotomizing themselves because they were so frightened of the future. And after that, they were more or less zombies who were completely happy with their circumstances. And they no longer worried or aspired to anything. And that's a story that tends to make young people cry, because it's all about that terror that you feel in your late 20s and in your 30s, when the world expects you to accomplish all of your major life things. Set up a home, set up a career, set up a family, find a mate. You really, and launch from your originating family. You're under so much pressure during that time. And we forget the terror of it. Anyway, I told the concept to my trainer, and it wasn't 4 or 5 years later that this trainer said, you had that story about the kids with the defibrillator. Did you ever do anything with it? And I thought, God bless you, Chris, because I had all but forgotten that story idea. And I thought, if Chris D'Amato remembered that premise for 6 years, then that's a good story idea. And so often you come up with an idea and it really has to cook for 6, 7, 8, or 10 years, especially the short stories. They just have to cook in your subconscious for a long time before you can really do something with them.
And the short stories demand more sometimes than the long form content, because they're like a meme. They have to work or not work.
And they have to have their own language, because with a short story, you can really burn the language. You can really distort and warp the language as if you were a lyricist, because, the songs work because they completely distort the language. And they also work because they only last 3 or 4 minutes. So the trick is with a short story is that you can really push the language and not worry about completely burning out the reader. You don't want to push the language that hard for 300 pages.
Yeah, I think the original Trainspotting book, he pushes it in that Scottish, brogue stuff for the whole thing. And it's hard to stay focused the whole time when you're trying to understand that communication, but it can also work in some situations.
There was a really landmark writer in the late 90s, a man named Mark Richard. And he wrote a collection called The Ice at the Bottom of the World. And he was the big name. And he had one story called Fish Boy that was really heavily stylized language with lots of S's and F's and V's, very soft sibilant sounds. And he decided he was going to make Fish Boy into a novel. And people really thought, all of publishing was going crazy, saying Fish Boy is the future. Fish Boy is going to be the Ulysses of our generation. And then Fish Boy came out, and it was such an extended sort of distortion of the language that people didn't read it. It was just really tough for folks. And so that's the benefit of the short story, is that the experiment will work where people won't tolerate for the longer form.
Wow, that's really insightful. I appreciate that. What's next in the next few years for you? I know you love doing the workshops, but I know the Zoom format's not ideal, and you seem to be writing a lot more lately. What are your plans?
You know, I'm working on another kind of thriller. Invention of Sound really forced me to kind of throw off a kind of snarkiness, a kind of detached sarcasm and irony that kind of typifies most of my work. And so I think in a way we are entering into an age where factual knowledge has almost no portend, that people constantly question the source of facts and what the facts indicate. And so, you could make the most reasonable argument to your best friend, and your best friend would still say, "What's your source? Where'd you see that?" And would instantly negate the best argument, the best set of facts, by questioning the authenticity of the source, the authority of the source. So I don't think that factual knowledge really carries very much authority anymore. I think more and more we're going to see authority carried by emotional appeal, almost like a religious-based narrative, where, with religion, it's all about the emotional engagement. It's not really about any kind of facts. It's all about sort of engaging with the narrative as an act of faith and the emotional payoff of it. So I'm working on trying to write a lot more fiction that has that kind of really strong emotional engagement, as opposed to that kind of intellectualized, clever, distant irony that I've used a lot in the past. So it's a new muscle for me.
And you seem excited to explore that.
It breaks my heart that there were, another writer of my generation, David Foster Wallace. He was so brilliant, and David was so clever, but he killed himself in 2008, and we never really got to see him kind of make the jump to more emotional, more, human work. And I want to make sure that I make that jump.
And does that come with age to a certain extent?
I remember my grandfather being more or less a kind of an angry bastard until he reached a certain age. And then he mellowed and he became a really nice guy. And I think that I'm kind of reaching that age, that really nice guy age, when I don't have to be angry about everything. I don't have to be afraid of everything. And I can risk being a human being and actually kind of, engaging with people as a human being.
Now, a lot of writers would be scared of that because they would think they would lose their mojo.
And people like Hunter S. Thompson, if you're going to play the tough guy your whole life, that is really a small box. And I'd like to be able to live in a bigger box, or at least in a different box, at least, explore a different box.
Yeah, maybe that's what drove him to suicide. Maybe he felt like he had to keep being that same character. Maybe that drove him crazy. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's one reason for sort of trying to make the work stand out there in front and not being the work yourself, not being the personality. I think Ken Kesey struggled with that as well.
I guess the work, almost by definition, takes you out of your own head and tries to destroy the ego in a way where you can live a connected life. If you really make it about the work, then it's not about you. But if you make it about you, that seems always to go down difficult roads.
And you're more likely to take it personally when people don't engage or they criticize the work. because then they're criticizing you. But when you do make it about the work, then you yourself are always down the road already engaged with something else. So you're not as emotionally invested in how the work is received by the world.
Yeah. You were always considered like the guy that made nihilism cool, but I've heard you say before that actually you're more of a romantic. And it's funny, even though on a granular level, you unpack these nihilistic elements like in Fight Club, and they really resonated with my nihilistic tendencies at the time, but there always is, I don't know, in a weird way, a hopeful arc or some type of romantic arc in your work. Is that true or not?
No, that's always true. And then in all of my work, it was about going through this long, arduous process to arrive at a moment of sentimentality, a moment of connectedness, and sort of the glimmer of a new possibility after everything is over. And so, I'd like to sort of expand from just a glimmer of possibility in new books. But I come from 1970s romantic fatalism, so I'm not sure if that is in my mojo, if I can achieve that, or whether the bad news bears will always lose, and Rocky will always lose, and the dance contest at the Odyssey is always rigged. That 70s fatalism that I grew up loving. Carrie will always burn up in her mother's house.
You think you think it's impossible to get some of that stuff out of your own DNA if you grew up and took it in subconsciously?
If it came during really formative imprinting years, then on some level, to me, that is a good story. And if I see a story that doesn't end in that kind of dark, conflicted, qualified way, I can't recognize the value in that story. So I might be doomed to always writing these kind of unhappily ever after stories.
Well, tragedies always survive. Shakespeare's good at those. There was I just wanted to finish on something. There was a quote, which I think is attributed to you, where you said, "We all die. The goal isn't to live forever. The goal is to create something that will." First of all, did you say that? And second of all, what does that mean? And what will your legacy be, Chuck?
That's actually a line from my book Diary. And I've always thought of myself as and not in a kind of martyr way, not in a kind of Catholic martyr way, but not such a precious thing that I can't risk wasting myself on something that, history can do without one man. I put that in another story, a character rationalizing his adventure. History can do without one man. And so I always think, who am I that I can't just kind of throw away my life on this quest to write one perfect sentence? That it kind of goes to Kierkegaard's leap of faith, that you can spend your life trying to keep yourself entertained and distracted, but eventually you have to face your mortality. And at that point, once you can face your mortality, you realize, I really have nothing to lose. So why don't I do the one thing I dream of doing? And that is creating something that transcends not just my experience, but really connects with a lot of people. And even if I fail at doing that, that's not a bad thing either, because, it's what I chose to do. Every time my life is messed up, I think this is what I chose to do. And so I can't argue with that.
Are you usually able to also think, I'm going to learn from this and this is going to make a great story? Or are you always not able to see it while you're in the middle of a challenging situation?
Now I can. Now I can kind of recognize the value in all, horribleness. I can take it to friends and talk to them and get their car crash story. And then eventually maybe a pattern will form and I'll be able to do something with it. The big box of porn in the woods. Everybody has got the big box of porn in the woods. And if you can talk about your box and how it left you traumatized, then people will rush forward to talk about their big box of porn in the woods. Yeah.
I'm thinking of my porn story as well in the woods. It was in the woods as well. Last question on legacy. Do you think we could look at every person in this world and all of our behaviors come down to one thing, which is somehow we want the world to remember that we were here once?
Which would be very Heidegger. This kind of quest for immortality, whether through our work or whether through our spirituality or whether through our offspring. That was so much of what Heidegger talked about, which is in a way a constant denial of death. I would say that is, for young people, a big thing, because it's young people who want to be vampires. Only young people want to live forever. Older people have seen enough that, they could check out. They don't want to be a vampire and live forever.
Sometimes I look at what I'm doing and I'm like, am I doing this because I know these digital files will be there forever and people will remember I'm here? And then I think, do I really want to live my life knowing that I created this one asset that's around forever? And then am I just getting too caught up in creating this legacy that's an ego-based decision? And I go back and forth with what's the right thing. It sounds like you lean more on it's worth if I can give my life for something that's going to be of value to the future. That's important to you. Is that right?
Boy, I am really all about, what is it called? Is it Aristotelian selfishness? That if the task does not serve me first and foremost, is not going to serve anyone else. And so at its core, basically, I just want to have a good time. I want to make the best use of my time so that when I reach the end of my life, I can look back and say, I had a fantastic time and I wrote things that were so beyond my ability. I somehow achieved these things. I do a lot of rock work. I do a lot of stone building. And sometimes I look at these walls that are 9, 10, 12 feet high, and I think, how the hell did I get that rock up there? That rock weighs 200 pounds. And I carried it up an aluminum ladder, and I placed it just right there and mortared it in. And so, in a way, I just want to live the kind of life where at the end of it, regardless of where the end is, whether it's a car accident or whether it's, whatever it is, at that moment, I can say, I did some impossible things. And I'm really, really glad I did.
Yeah. What scares you?
My nightmares are all of my dog being in peril and me not being able to save my dog.
Does that mean that's what scares you? Or is that just the nightmares?
And that's, that is the kind of the greatest, fear. And whether the dog represents something other than the dog.
Children?
That being buried alive.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
I know you've spoke of children and how you think you won't have any and how you explore those topics through your books. Have you ever considered that more, and would you ever?
No, I think it's way too late in my life to really, consider having kids. And at this point, a lot of my writing, a lot of, my speaking is trying to sort of pass along the things that people have taught to me at the same time that I acknowledge who taught me these things. So it doesn't sound like everything's just coming out of my mouth.
Right. Chuck, I always finish with a couple questions. I'll just do this right now. If you could pick up some magic phone and call up 20-year-old Chuck and give him some advice based on everything you know now, what would you say to him, if anything? And what would he think of you calling him?
The following success secrets are only available inside the London Real Tribe, where you get exclusive access and insights from our high-performance guests on wealth creation, productivity, leadership, morning routines, health, and well-being. To join our tribe community, go to londonreal.tv/tribe. Now, let's continue with the show.
Okay. But no comms going in there. I think that's great advice. I think it's great advice, and probably one of the hardest things to do these days for any young person is to actually tune out. But yeah, it's great advice, and I'm sure that's where a lot of the gold lies. Chuck, thank you so much for your time. If we do this again, let's do it in person. Maybe you come to London. Who knows? We'll see what happens in the future.
Thank you very much. And you do look great. That is a great tie with a great shirt. I'm sorry people can't see that.
I took a gamble today, and sometimes gambles pay off. You got to take risks, right? Purple on blue. So look, I appreciate your time. I mean, I don't want to be the guy that tells you another story about how much Fight Club meant to them, but I'm that guy too. So I must have watched that movie a couple hundred times on repeats in 2001 in New York City when I was going through the worst year of my life. And somehow it was therapeutic. Who knows, Chuck? Maybe somehow you kept me alive during that period where I almost died a couple times. So thank you for the creation of what you do. I went on to read most of your books in London, and I remember having those moments where I was literally in public reading your book, feeling like I was doing something wrong and thinking, man, just when I think he can't go anywhere further out there, he goes light years further out there. And yeah, I appreciate your writing style that caused that visceral reaction in me and so many people. So thanks for doing what you're doing. You seem like you're in a great place. This book is incredible, Invention of Sound. And I'm looking forward to this new you, this new genre of you coming up. So yeah, thanks for doing everything you do. I appreciate it.
Hey, thank you. Wow. Oh, my day is made.
All right, good. That's success then. Awesome. Well, stay safe, and hopefully next time we'll do this in person, and all the best to you, Chuck.
Take care.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining us on London Real. We'll see you next time. Take care.